Good morning and welcome. Welcome. A little chilly out there. It always is in Storrs, I warn you. I am Denise Merrill. I'm chair of the America 250 Connecticut Commission. You might remember me from my role as former Secretary of the State. And is the current Secretary of the State still here? Yes, she is. Welcome, Stephanie Thomas, who's doing a wonderful job. The commission is here to look back. We established the commission 3 years ago now. The governor appointed a group and asked me to chair the commission, which I gladly did. And we've been working very hard, really, for the last 3 years, trying to organize a celebration, a commemoration of events, people, and ideas from the formation of the country 250 years ago. But more importantly, as we've come to see it, it's about looking ahead and building a state and country that we are all proud of. So that's our job. We took it very seriously. We've been meeting for 3 years now. And by the way, we are focused on Connecticut. There is also, of course, a national commission. But as you know, Connecticut played a rather outsized role in the American Revolution and continues today to be an important player in these things. So I know many of you are here from various organizations that have been long at work on thinking about these matters. I want to just talk for a minute about what we have accomplished just this year in the last few years. So we launched an affiliate program to find ways to co-brand and promote events being planned around the state. We are up to over 90 affiliate organizations, which is very exciting. We have expanded the number of local committees. We have always felt that this will essentially be a bottom-up celebration, that we hope that every town in Connecticut will do something around the 250th. And so we now have over 80 towns are participating and have signed up with our website, and I'm sure you all probably got here through the website. So we've been working with organizations such as COST, which is the Council of Small Towns, CCM meetings. We've gone to meetings all around the state with the local first selectmen and mayors and tried to encourage them to form committees in their towns. So if there is anyone here that's in a town that still doesn't have a committee with us, please feel free to mention it to them and try to get something going in your town. We're trying to also get the word out to the general public through participating in festivals and parades around the state. We've been doing that for several years now. I remember from my days as a politician marching in many parades, and I've seen we've had booths around the state at the various parades, so we'll continue to do that. We have always envisioned it as a grassroots affair, as I said. So today I'm excited. We have 250 people, isn't that interesting? Gathered here today to talk about our plans for 2026 and beyond, and envisioning how we can tell more stories, engage with civics and history, and celebrate the many communities that make Connecticut so special. As we move into the new year, we're excited to bring on board more affiliates, local committees. We have plans to bring educational opportunities into the hands of Connecticut's residents, and this will include curriculum packets for teachers, a statewide exhibition, and opportunities to participate in service days. Thank you again to the many people in the room. Commission members are here. We have subcommittees that are working on various aspects of this, and we like to see everyone see us as an organizing entity. We do have themes that I think the themes are very important, and probably hear a little more about that later. But as I said at the beginning, we see this not only as looking back, but as looking forward. And I think that's a really important point at this moment in our history. So thank you very much for being here, and I look forward to a great year of activity around the state. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Cindy Tolosa, who works at the Connecticut Humanities Council. She's organizing these events and our commission. And as you probably know, the Connecticut Humanities Council is the coordinating entity for the commission. So I want to thank Cindy in advance for her work on this. Thanks so much.
Thank Thanks, Denise, and thank you all for joining us here today. We're really excited to have everybody here at UConn and have a whole day of activities planned. It is my pleasure to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Michael D. Hattem, who's joining us from New Haven. Michael is a historian of the American Revolution and historical memory. He received his PhD in history from Yale University and is the author of The Memory of 76, The Revolution in American History, and Past and Prologue, Politics and Memory in the American Revolution. He's taught history at Knox College and the New School, and his work has been covered in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, and the Washington Post. He currently serves as Associate Director of the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute, and I am excited to turn it over to Michael.
Thank you, Denise and Cindy and Rachel, for organizing in the Connecticut Humanities Council. I am quite honored by the invitation to speak to you all this morning. Obviously, the occasion for this gathering is the upcoming 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and there is a long history of commemorating the Declaration. 1826, 1876, 1926, and of course, most recently in living memory, the bicentennial. And I cover the history of these commemorations in my most recent book, The Memory of 76. So I'm not going to do that today, but with 2026 coming, I think it's just useful to understand that the act of commemorating the Declaration itself has a long and interesting history. And in many ways, these commemorations and these anniversaries have become a sort of periodic civic ritual that binds us to previous generations of Americans and provides an opportunity for the nation to reflect on not only its past, but also its present and its future. And I think that that, broadly speaking, really is the opportunity that is provided by 2026. And so I'm going to begin my talk today by giving a brief overview of how the colonies came to declare independence and how the Declaration came about. Because after all, we're not just commemorating the Declaration of Independence, we're also commemorating independence itself, and that was a process. And then I'm going to use the second half of my talk to explore the role of the Declaration in American history, in American politics and culture over the last 250 years, and give a little sense of how the ways that Americans have understood and interpreted the Declaration has changed over time. Now, the Declaration and the declaring of independence was the culmination of more than a decade-long conflict between colonists and Britain that historians often refer to as the imperial crisis. After the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, Britain began to pass legislation aimed at raising revenue from the colonies and also sort of consolidating its authority, centralizing its authority over the colonies. Now, after the Stamp Act in 1765 and the Townshend Acts in 1767, both occasioned violent protest and economic boycotts. Both of those acts were repealed. And then by 1773, things had calmed down for a while when Parliament passed the Tea Act. And what the Tea Act was an attempt to sort of prop up the failing East India Company by giving them a monopoly on the tea that was imported into the colonies. And of course, Bostonians famously responded to that with the Boston Tea Party in December of 1773. And there were actually many tea parties that occurred throughout the colonies in the weeks after what happened in Boston. And Parliament, being indignant at this destruction of property, passed the infamous Coercive Acts, which basically shut down local government in Massachusetts and closed Boston Harbor. And it was this unprecedented act by Parliament of sort of taking over the government of a colony that led the colonists to create a Continental Congress in 1774 to coordinate their response. The Congress spent the fall and the winter of 1774 into 75 focused on negotiating a reconciliation with Britain. But then in April of 1775, fighting broke out at Lexington and Concord between British regulars and colonial militia, and this is effectively the beginning of the War for Independence. even though Congress was not yet willing to consider independence as an option. Later that year, the Congress sent its olive branch petition directly to the king. And when the response from the king came in December of 1775 in the form of a proclamation calling on all colonists to suppress the rebellion being fomented by the Congress, the door to independence finally began opening. In January of 1776, Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet, Common Sense, is published. This pamphlet was hugely influential with its critiques of not only Great Britain, but of monarchy itself. Paine appealed to his readers famously in very common, direct language with plenty of biblical allusions. And all through the remaining winter and spring into 1776, his pamphlet circulated throughout the colonies, convincing ever more colonists that independence was not just increasingly an option, but maybe the only option. Now, by May of 1776, there had been a military conflict going on between Britain and the colonies for more than a year. And it was then that Congress finally began moving toward independence. There had been a few radicals in the Congress, John Adams, Samuel Adams, people like that, who had wanted independence almost from the start. But most of the elites in Congress had been for reconciliation, basically since the Congress had convened in 1774. And they held on to that hope well into 1776. And that's because the colonists were proud British subjects. They had been especially proud ever since the end of the 7 Years' War and largely the removal of the French Empire from the what would later become the territory of the United States. But throughout 1775, even though Congress is moving slowly, ordinary colonists throughout 1775 really sort of took the lead while Congress was waffling. Towns and counties across the colonies began to pass their own declarations of independence effectively. And this is covered in a great book by the late historian Pauline Maier called American Scripture. And so you have this situation where, a year or so earlier, independence had been an unthinkable option. And now only in 1775 for the general public does it start to become a real possibility. And so public sentiment for it really began growing. And it's one of the primary drivers behind pushing the Congress towards independence. And it's in May of 1776 that Congress finally sort of catches up with this public sentiment. And that month, the Congress passed a resolution calling on, stating that the exercise of every kind of authority under the crown should be totally suppressed, and all the powers of government exerted under the authority of the people of the colonies. And that resolution is essentially instructing the provisional assemblies in each of the colonies to start making plans to form their own independent state governments. So it's the first signal from the Congress that independence is coming. It's just 3 weeks later, on June 7th, when Richard Henry Lee of Virginia proposes the Independence Resolution. This is the manuscript copy of that, where, famously it reads, "Resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they're absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved." Now, expecting that the Congress would eventually pass this resolution, a committee was appointed on June 11th to draft a formal Declaration of Independence. And of course, it famously included Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Robert R. Livingston of New York, and Roger Sherman of Connecticut. And because of his reputation as a writer, because of his sort of fiery 1774 pamphlet, Jefferson was chosen to create the first draft. Now, a few more weeks passed because delegates of a few colonies like South Carolina and New York were were actually forbidden for voting for independence by their official instructions from their provisional assemblies. And now, with the matter coming to a head, Congress takes a break for a few weeks to give these delegates time to request and receive new instructions, given the increasingly tenuous circumstances. And so that's why it's not until July 2nd that a vote on the independence resolution happens, nearly a month after it is first proposed. And a big part of that is that the vote in the Congress for independence had to be unanimous. And so that's why they were willing to wait, several weeks just to get these last few colonies on board. On July 2nd, this independence resolution passes with 12 yeas and 1 abstention. And that abstention was from New York because the delegates had not been able to secure permission to vote yes, given the fact that New York City was about to be occupied by the British Army and Navy. And so, in other words, July 2nd is the day that independence happens, right? And it's immediately after the vote that Jefferson's draft of the Declaration was put to the Congress as a whole, and debate goes on for 2 more days with various delegates suggesting changes to make edits. This is an inset from the famous John Trumbull painting that's sometimes I see referred to as the signing of the Declaration of Independence, but it's actually the committee presenting the draft of the Declaration to the Congress as a whole. Now, on July 4th, the Declaration is finally approved, of course, and it is immediately read aloud in Philadelphia and sent to a local printer for copies to be made and circulated throughout the colonies. And it's over the next couple of weeks that the Declaration sort of slowly makes its way out from Philadelphia, to Massachusetts and Vermont, east to New Jersey, New York, and Delaware, and south to Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. And one of the questions that I often get about the Declaration is, why was it necessary? And that answer, I think, is really in the Declaration's preamble. It reads, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands that have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. And in other words, the colonies wanted to assume their place among the powers of the earth as a recognized nation state. And to achieve that recognition meant addressing the opinions of mankind, meaning the entire world, right? And when the committee to draft the Declaration was formed, Congress also named another committee to draft a call for foreign alliances. And the work of those 2 committees was actually directly intertwined. The Declaration was not a plan of government. It was essentially a PR document, and also part of the Congress's plans for enlisting foreign support in the coming war against the British. And so the Americans would state their rightful case for independence in a declaration, and this would then convince foreign nations to sign treaties with them. That's the basic idea. And they kind of needed to offer a sort of airtight case, and that's why we get the long list of grievances in the Declaration, because many of the empires that they were going to be seeking alliances with, chiefly France and Spain, were monarchies, and they would not necessarily be inclined to support a Republican rebellion against the king. So you might notice that nowhere in the Declaration does Jefferson criticize monarchy itself, like Paine did in Common Sense. Instead, he criticizes George III specifically, and that's actually led many many generations of Americans to see the Declaration of Independence as fundamentally anti-monarchy, anti-monarchical. But that's a sort of misunderstanding. The reason that the Declaration addresses the king directly so much is because colonists had already been making claims since 1768 that Parliament had no authority over them. And basically their argument was, from 68 on to 76, was that their only connection to the British Empire was through the king. Had nothing to do with Parliament. Parliament had no jurisdiction. And that's why the Declaration focuses so much on George III, and why the grievances also are specifically tied to him, because in their minds, that is the last political band that is connecting them to the British Empire. It's not because it's not because the revolution was fundamentally anti-monarchical in nature. And I think that one of the great ironies about the Declaration and about independence itself is that for colonists who often use the word innovation as a sort of epithet, they spent more than a decade complaining to Britain that Parliament was doing unprecedented things with these legislations. But in the end, it was their commitment to the sort of importance of precedence and of custom and tradition that ultimately forced them into embarking on the sort of ultimate unprecedented innovation of independence. And so that's my sort of nutshell history of how the Declaration came about. But what I really want to talk about is the role of the Declaration in American history since July 4th, 1776, the sort of afterlife of the Declaration, you might say. For 2 decades after independence, the Declaration was not seen as especially important. To most, it symbolized independence and the union of the states. And for that reason, the most important part of it was the grievances, not the preamble. The preamble was not celebrated in sort of the way that it has been for the last 150 years in the earliest years of the Republic. There were a few early exceptions to that, though. Primarily a few African-American writers who grasped the power and the utility of the preamble statement of equality far more immediately than white Americans did. This is Lemuel Haynes. He was born in 1753 in Connecticut to a white mother and a black father. And after completing a period of indentured servitude, he became a Minuteman and later participated in the seizure of Fort Ticonderoga with Ethan Allen. Now, immediately after the Declaration became public knowledge, Haynes began to connect the Patriots' cause with that of enslaved persons. And in 1776, he writes an essay entitled "Liberty Further Extended," where it appears that he is the first person to quote the phrase "life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness" from the Declaration of Independence. Haynes pointed out that there was, in the new independent states, quote, "greater oppression than that which Englishmen seem so much to spurn at, an oppression which they themselves impose upon others." And then he also wrote that liberty is equally as precious to a black man as it is to a white one, and bondage as equally as intolerable to the one as it is to the other. Haynes later became an ordained congregational minister and the first African-American to preach to a white congregation in the United States. And so he was one of the first Americans to quote the preamble of the Declaration and its statement about human equality, and therefore sort of in a real sense kind of begins the process of canonizing equality as a sort of first principle of the American Revolution, as an ideal of the revolution. And he also helped begin the process of publicly redefining the Declaration from a document about national independence and union to one about universal rights. Now, again, for the first 50 years, the Declaration symbolizes independence and union, and that only really begins to change significantly in the 1830s with the rise of abolitionism. And in fact, it was the abolitionist movement in the 1830s, 1840s that effectively created the modern memory of the Declaration of Independence. As we know it today, this idea of the Declaration being defined primarily by the preamble and the statement in the preamble about liberty and equality. Abolitionist writers and orators repeatedly mention the Declaration, including notably here in the first issue of The Liberator in 1831. This is one of the most important abolitionist newspapers of the era. And you can see the connection to the revolutionists generally in William Lloyd Garrison's sort of introductory essay in the first issue, where he explains the symbolism behind publishing the newspaper in Boston. And he writes, "I determined at every hazard to lift up the standard of emancipation in the eyes of the nation within sight of Bunker Hill and in the birthplace of liberty." Abolitionists meeting in Vermont in 1833 passed a resolution stating that slavery in 1833 is incompatible with the Declaration of Independence in 1776. In 1839, the Old Colony Anti-Slavery Society in Plymouth resolved that the Declaration was, quote, "the fundamental document of our national existence." And so what's happening here is that the abolitionists began to define the Declaration by the principle of equality, and they began to define the revolution by the Declaration. And you won't be surprised to know that this did not escape the notice of Southerners. In a newspaper in South Carolina in 1835, one pro-slavery writer dismissed the phrase, "all men are created equal," as, quote, rhetorical flourish, and claimed that it was to blame for the wild theories of liberty that were held by so many, meaning abolitionism. In the hands of the abolitionists, Southerners claimed that the Declaration had become a, quote, very seditious instrument. And for them, the Constitution, which protected slavery, was the fundamental or defining document of the American Revolution, not the Declaration. And so these two founding documents were seen by both sides as fundamentally different and in direct opposition to one another. You have the Radical Declaration with its pronouncements of liberty and equality, and then the Constitution, which established and maintained law and order, and of course, slavery. And abolitionists and pro-slavery Southerners fought throughout the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s over which of those documents and hence which principles define the revolution, and by extension define the nation. In some sense, the abolitionists hoped that the Declaration would help save the nation from slavery, while Southerners hoped that the Constitution would save slavery from the Declaration. Now, in 1852, Frederick Douglass gave his famous speech in Rochester, New York on July 5th. And of course, having an event the day after the 4th of July was a sort of custom meant to highlight how far the nation was from realizing the ideals of the founding. And in that speech, Douglass began by praising the revolution and the founders. He wrote, where he said, "Fellow citizens, I am not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. The point from which I am compelled to view them is not certainly the most favorable, and yet I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration." But when he turned his view to the present, his tone turned as well. He said that the character and conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me than on this 4th of July. Whether we turn to declarations of the past or professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. And then the famous quote, which gives this sort of speech its generally recognized title. "What to the American slave is your 4th of July, he asked. A day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. And to him, your celebration is a sham." And Douglass was castigating those who would celebrate Independence Day while ignoring slavery, right? He called that a hollow mockery of the revolution and its ideals. And he said that all the shouts about liberty and equality were, quote, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. What the abolitionists had begun and what Douglass had rendered so clear on this day in 1852 was, I argue, a new way for how Americans would relate to the memory of the American Revolution. To celebrate the revolution, but to not do anything about unfreedom or inequality was an insult to the memory of the revolution. That's the argument that Douglass is making. And the real way to honor the revolution's memory for Douglass was to work toward more actively realizing its most fundamental ideals of liberty and equality. So for Douglass, the founding may have happened in 1776, but the revolution was still going on. Until those ideals were fully realized, the revolution would remain unfinished. And it's this idea of an unfinished revolution that would go on to inspire countless social movements throughout American history, who also sought to more fully realize those ideals of liberty and equality for oppressed and marginalized groups. Now, at the same time, Southerners continue to dismiss the Declaration. In 1857, George Fitzhugh, who was a well-known pro-slavery Southern writer, argued that liberty and equality are new things under the sun. In other words, he's saying that those are not principles of the revolution, that those are sort of new Northern principles that he blamed for all the problems of the North. Jefferson, for writing the Declaration, was described as a fanatical political monomaniac and the father of all the calamities that are now being visited upon the nation for having written the Declaration. And of course, most famously, there is the cornerstone speech by Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, in March of 1861, where he declares that the Confederacy's cornerstone rests upon the great truth of white supremacy. And this cornerstone idea of white supremacy, he argued, had actually been rejected by the first builders, by the founders in 1776. He argued that they believed that slavery was in violation of the laws of nature, which is an allusion to the Declaration. And then he says those ideas were fundamentally wrong. And so for Southerners to establish their new nation based on white supremacy, they really were compelled to reject the Declaration of Independence because it had come to be seen by 1861 widely as incompatible with slavery, thanks to the work of abolitionists and people like Frederick Douglass. And then that view of the Declaration really is sort of canonized just a few years later by Abraham Lincoln and in the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln talked about the Declaration often, and he saw it as fundamentally an anti-slavery document. In a speech in 1858, he said, if you have been taught doctrines in conflict with the great landmarks of the Declaration of Independence, if you've been inclined to believe that all men are not created equal, let me entreat you to come back and return to the fountain whose waters spring close by the blood of the Revolution. Just before his first inauguration in 1861, Lincoln spoke in front of Independence Hall here. And he said, I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. And then, of course, on that November day in 1863 at Gettysburg, Lincoln told the audience that the Revolution of 1776 had created a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Those are the two fundamental principles of the Declaration. He's defining the revolution and the nation by the Declaration of Independence. And he also argued in the address that Americans' rededication to these two principles of liberty and equality during the Civil War would give them, quote, a new birth of freedom. So in his mind, the Civil War had become a conflict about these two revolutionary principles of liberty and equality that came directly from the Declaration. But even before the Civil War in the 1840s and 1850s, the women's rights movements, which was a forerunner of the suffragist movement, fought for the rights of married women. In many states, single and widow women could own property and sign contracts and receive inheritances, but married women could not. And in 1851, the National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts, declared that the injustice done to women as contrary alike to the principles of humanity and the Declaration of Independence. Reformers contended that the gendered nature of the Declaration's statement about equality, all men are created equal, was more stylistic than specific. At that Worcester Convention, one speaker charged that anyone who shall contend that men in that memorable document does not stand for the human race, charged them with gross dishonesty or ignorance. It was inconceivable, this woman argued, that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are the inalienable rights of half only of the human species. They also argued that property-owning women were being subjected to taxation without representation, since their property could be taxed, but they could not vote. An 1853 Women's Rights Convention in New York City, someone questioned, is it not a principle of American law that no human being ought to be held responsible for a law to which they have not consented? And was that not the very principle of our revolution? And so the women's rights movement in the 1840s and 1850s really drew heavily on the memory of the revolution and the Declaration in making their case for rights for women. And of course, the most famous expression of that movement was the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments in 1848, where their declaration effectively reproduces the Declaration of Independence with the preamble changed to include women, that all men and women are created equal. And they also substituted their own list of grievances, including overly restrictive divorce laws, the inability of women to work for themselves, and the imposition of more stringent moral standards on women. In the late 19th century, the National Women's Suffrage Association took advantage of the centennial anniversary of independence in 1876, when the leaders of that movement petitioned the Centennial Commission for a place on the program of the main July 4th event in Philadelphia in front of Independence Hall. The all-male commission refused, but did give them a few tickets for seats in the reserve section behind the speakers. And their hope had been to be able to read their Declaration of Rights right after the Declaration of Independence had been read. On that day, though, they waited until the Declaration had been read from the podium, and then in between the sort of hubbub in between speakers, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton walk up onto the dais and began handing out printed copies of their Declaration of Rights. And this caused such a stir that people paid attention to them as they handed out copies as they walked through the crowd, which followed them over to a small stage on the side where Anthony read the Declaration of Rights of the Women of the United States. They made their case to the public that denying female suffrage was to deny the principles of the Revolution and the Declaration. And they also drew on this idea of an unfinished revolution, the idea that one honored the revolution by working toward more fully realizing its principles. If we jump forward to the mid-20th century, the civil rights movement also drew heavily on the Declaration and this idea of the unfinished revolution. As early as 1956, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a speech entitled The Declaration of Independence and the Negro before 1,600 people at a Jefferson Day rally at the University of Chicago. When in 1963, King was jailed in Birmingham, in his famous letter, reacting to claims that he was an extremist, he wrote, was not Jesus an extremist for love, and Thomas Jefferson for writing, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. He reminded his readers that African Americans had been equal contributors to the nation even before the Revolution and were therefore equal inheritors of its legacy. He wrote, before the pen of Jefferson etched the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence across the pages of history, we were here. And yet he spoke of the quote, great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the Declaration of Independence, sounding much like Douglas. When King spoke at the March on Washington in 1963, he argued that the Declaration was a, quote, promissory note, right, to which every American was to fall heir. A promise that all men, Black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This puts the Declaration at the center of one of the most iconic events of the 1960s. In the bicentennial of 1976, there would be subsequent civil rights movements that would also tie their cause to the Declaration and this idea of an unfinished revolution. On July 4th, 1976, Karen DeCrow, the president of the National Organization for Women, reread Susan B. Anthony's speech from 1876. And at a rally in East Los Angeles, Jan Tucker, a member of the Peace and Freedom Party, told the reporter that we have to raise the issue this year that the American Revolution didn't just stop in 1776, that it is still going on. In the early 1960s, the Mattachine Society, a pioneering gay rights organization, declared that its goal was to, quote, secure for the homosexual the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as proclaimed for all men by the Declaration of Independence. In 1965, they held a public protest in front of Independence Hall where the Declaration was passed, just like civil rights movement groups like CORE had done in recent years. Pride parades in New York and Los Angeles in 1976 featured Spirit of 76 banners and floats featuring participants dressed in drag in colonial era costumes. The anniversary of the bicentennial provided these rather newer movements for civil rights an opportunity to express their desire, not just for equal rights before the law, but for their right of belonging in the nation. And they did this in part by drawing on the Declaration and this idea of an unfinished revolution. So this morning, I've hoped to give you a little background on the history of the Declaration in a sense of how the Declaration has had this afterlife over the last 250 years. In that afterlife, which none of the founders, including Jefferson, could have possibly predicted, this document, which was intended initially to be essentially a press release and the basis for seeking foreign support in the war, would have its meaning changed from symbolizing independence and union to becoming a sort of aspirational symbol for succeeding generations of Americans seeking to right the nation's wrongs and to cure its ills. And the ideals in the Declaration made it possible for the emergence of this idea of the unfinished revolution, which I would argue has been one of the most powerful ideas in American history, because it has helped inspire and serve as a sort of tool for many of our most important and successful social movements, and thereby helping achieve a more fully realized, though of course imperfect, vision of liberty and equality in the United States. The memory of the American Revolution is not about history as much as it is about the present. And I think we see that in the examples that I gave, that is essentially always been the case. The revolution has provided us with a sort of shared political language that we use to express our concerns and our dissatisfactions in the present, as well as our visions of the future. And no text has been more key in shaping that political language than the Declaration of Independence, which has really helped reinforce our civic identity with its sense of aspiration and idealism and a belief and commitment to progress. And I think that is why so many generations of Americans who have dedicated their lives to achieving greater equality and freedom for all have used the Declaration to help voice and legitimize their goals. And so this idea of the unfinished revolution and this long history of how the Declaration has been used by the marginalized and the powerless, I think is critical if we want to shape a commemoration for the 250 that is rooted in belonging. The way that generations of Americans have made the Declaration their own, really beckons us to do the same. The great lesson, I think, from this history is that the Declaration is not just a static document from 1776, entombed in an airtight glass case in the National Archives. It's a living, breathing platform for change. It's a tool for civic engagement and for inspiring discussions about ideals like liberty, equality, and independence, regardless of the degree to which those things existed in 1776 specifically. And this anniversary is an opportunity for Americans to think more deeply about what those ideals mean to them personally, and what they should look like in the world today. In some sense, Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, Martin Luther King Jr., and countless other ordinary Americans who took part in these movements, whose names will never be remembered, in some sense have just as much of a claim to being thought of as an author of the Declaration of Independence as Jefferson, because of the ways that they reinterpreted that document over time. And I think that if we can inspire some Americans through this anniversary to engage with the Declaration in this way, to redefine its ideals for themselves and thereby lay their own claims to being part of the legacy of the Declaration, and to lay their claims to belonging in the nation, and to appreciate the long tradition of which they are then a part, I think we may yet have a successful commemoration rooted in belonging. Thank you.
So we are happy to open up to a bit of question and answer. And what we'll do is we'll grab the second mic and walk around the room if anybody has any questions you'd like to ask. If you could raise your hand so that we can see you.
Thank you. Just a quick question. How do you go about explaining the removal of the single largest section of the Declaration, which was complaining about the existence of slavery?
Say that again.
The single largest section of the Declaration that was removed was a section by Jefferson that blaming the king for the existence of slavery.
Yeah.
How do we go about explaining that?
I mean, in a lot of ways, this famous passage in the Jefferson's original draft, which kind of lays the blame for slavery in the colonies at the feet of George III and of the British Empire generally. But of course, that section was removed by Southern delegates during those 2 days where the Congress was debating the original draft. There's a great significance in the fact that Jefferson chose to include that, of course. There is equal significance in the fact that it was taken out, right, due to the politics around slavery inside of the Continental Congress. But I mean, one of the things I found when I was working on this book, and I was working on this sort of period of the 1830s, or 1820s and 1830s, is that routinely there would be public controversies about the authorship of the Declaration of Independence, because there were many Federalists who were annoyed that every July 4th Jefferson was praised, across the country, and tried to make the case that, or diminish his claim to being the author of the Declaration. And often when those controversies occurred in newspapers and public print, one of the ways that writers seeking to defend Jefferson and his claim to being the author of the Declaration would be to reprint that original draft, including in Southern newspapers. There was the Richmond Inquirer in the 1830s publishes the slavery section from the original draft, and then basically says it's a wonder why they took it out. I mean, in Richmond, Virginia, you know, so it's kind of complicated the way that we have viewed that slavery section from the original draft, and how we have viewed it has certainly changed over time.
Thank you. You'd mentioned that the Declaration of Independence, originally the idea was going to be a press release, and then it somehow became the living, breathing platform for change. How did that happen? How did that shift happen, whether the way in which it was written or the way people engaged with it? What led to that change in purpose?
The seeds are planted by Jefferson's inclusion of the preamble, right? The preamble is not necessary to declaring independence in July of 1776 or for securing foreign alliances, right? It is a sort of general, universal statement of rights and equality that he began the document with. So in some sense, he plants the seeds almost entirely unknowingly, right? Could not have possibly have anticipated how that section would have been interpreted going forward in many of the examples that I gave. Not sure that Jefferson never intended for women to use his preamble to try to secure suffrage for themselves. So in some sense, it's kind of embedded in the structure of the document, the possibility for that change. It's embedded in the preamble and its universal language. But it's also a product of circumstances, right? For the first couple of decades, that didn't happen. That change didn't happen. And it really is the abolitionists who bring who changed the tenor of the nation's racial politics and the discourse around the nation's racial politics, which is really in some sense the abolitionists' greatest achievement. And it's that new discourse around race in the United States in the 1830s, 1840s, that also then, you know, creates these sort of circumstances where that preamble can be utilized in this new kind of way and for this new kind of purpose. And then, of course, it's a sort of a sort of linked chain going forward, right? And then, you know, the national the women's rights movement takes their cue from the abolitionists. The suffragist movement takes their cue from the original women's rights movements. The civil rights movement takes their cue from all of them. And the same thing for the gay and lesbian rights movement. So it creates a sort of it's had a sort of snowball effect, and that's a product of the structure of the document itself, and also, you know, the context in any given time. Yeah.
I wonder about Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson's connection in potential co-authorship. I wonder how much the dots have been connected between Thomas Paine's founding of the Abolitionist Society in Philadelphia and the actual collaboration with Jefferson.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those rumors, somewhat persistent rumor, I guess. But there's no evidence that Paine had anything to do with the Declaration, or certainly, or even with the slavery portion of the Declaration. We don't have any evidence that would really suggest that. And partly it's been a product of the fact of just how singular Paine is among the founders, among the revolutionary generation. In many ways, maybe in all ways, he was the most radical out of all of them. And this made him persona non grata amongst many of those founders. And so there is an idea that maybe the most radical part of the Declaration, Or if the Declaration comes to be seen as this radical document, then maybe the most radical founder must have had a hand in it, right? Which is logical, but not historically proven. It's not evidentiary. There's no evidentiary basis for it. But it's partly because of his reputation and also the changing reputation of the Declaration, which makes him seem more like an author of it, even though that's not the case, as far as we know.
Hi, I'm here representing the Temple Beth Israel Preservation Society. As a child, I remember learning that the founding fathers were all Christians. And I'm been recently hearing that many of them were either Unitarian or Universalist. And I was just wondering if you knew anything about the theological makeup of the founding fathers.
I mean, first of all, the term founding fathers is so ambiguous. It can mean, does it mean the men who were in the Continental Congress? Does it mean the men who were in the Constitutional Convention a decade later? Does it mean only the ones who were in both? But in terms, if we say, for argument's sake, the Continental Congress that passes the Independence Resolution, their religious beliefs were largely reflected the regions that they came from, right? So the New England delegates were all Congregationalists. There was more religious diversity in the middle colonies, in New York, in New Jersey, and Delaware. And in Virginia, they were largely Anglicans because that was the predominant church in Virginia, though there were new denominations that were starting to emerge around this time, like Baptists and Methodists, which originated in England. From my perspective as a historian of the 18th century, I would say that they had a quite diverse religious affiliations, because they basically represented most of the predominant denominations, Christian denominations in the colonies at the time, and that was actually pretty rare. Besides for New York City, a lot of the colonies was pretty homogenous religiously, and so in some sense, they reflect the wide array of religious denominations from the time, but also a little bit unique for doing that because it's kind of an uncommon thing, certainly outside of New York.
Hi, thanks so much for this great talk. I really appreciate it. I think the way I hear it, there's kind of two implications to two ways we could take your talk. One is that over the generations, just a parade of leftists have hijacked the Declaration. Here comes Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony and Lincoln and King to make that document into something it wasn't.
Yeah.
And the other version is that founding generation left an aspiration for other people to make real.
Right.
And as we go back to our museums and historical societies and classrooms, this is the group here.
Yeah.
Which message, which version of the story do you want us to take back with us?
That's funny. I actually don't think of those as two distinct stories. I think I would choose your second characterization over the first, right? In the book, I do talk about the change over time for how, what we might think of as conservatives or, sort of the American right has changed how they've thought about the Declaration of Independence. It's the memory of the revolution, the conservative memory of the revolution, basically since the Cold War has been defined by the idea of individual liberty, limited government, right? And free trade or capitalism, right? And the seeds for that were planted in the early 20th century in no small part because of the Bolshevik Revolution and the panic that it caused. And then it really gets sort of consolidated in the 1950s. And in many ways, that Cold War memory of the revolution is still alive and well throughout the country, right? But that idea, especially that idea of individual liberty as that's being what defines the Declaration, that libertarian reading of the Declaration, is in some sense rather recent, certainly more recent than, the leftist Frederick Douglass's reading of it, right? Yeah, I mean, I think it is an aspirational story about, about generation after generation, reckoning with the Declaration and what its ideals should mean to them in the present, right? It's not about, we don't read the Declaration in an originalist way, the way some people read the Constitution. For all of the people that I talked about in these social movements, it really didn't matter to them what Jefferson thought those words meant, right? It was, what mattered was what they meant to them in the present and how they wanted their definitions of those ideals to be manifested in the future, right? And so that's what I think is the story, right? And I think that having a sense of this history is that once you engage with the Declaration in that way, you should feel a part of this very long tradition, in American history of in some sense remaking, or in some sense rewriting the Declaration for yourself, for your community, for your time. Yeah, it's, the thing about it is that the way that the narrative played out in the research and writing of the book is that, the most sort of use of the Declaration and the memory of the revolution just generally on let's for liberal causes, let's say, instead of leftist, but leftist causes, was largely through grassroots movements, and that the memory of the revolution, the use of that sort of on the other end of the political spectrum, has been more rooted in preserving institutions, right, and preserving the manner of institutions at any time, and so that's a fundamental difference, right? Like, there's this grassroots on the one hand, and so instead of thinking of it as leftist or liberal, it's the grassroots part of it that kind of matters to me. Whether it would be left or right, it's the fact that people are reconsidering the Declaration, redefining the Declaration for themselves and for their own time. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.